Hello, everyone. I'm hoping everyone can hear me. All right. So for those, I guess there'll still be people joining as we go, but I've got a very tight deadline. We have to finish by 3, including questions. So I'm gonna dive right in. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history very quickly for those who are unaware. But last year, sometime, the Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition instructed ITAC, the International Trade Administration Commission, to do a review of the steel industry. And everything was very quiet. Nobody knew about it. Then we got to December last year. And in Parliament, the EFF posed a question to Minister Tao and said, what is going on with your steel review? And then he said, no, I've told ITAC to get busy with this. And this is the review that is kicked off. So we had a webinar in January, which we kind of tried to work out what would likely happen. This has exceeded all expectations in its scope. And so what we're going to do is talk you through this, raise some of the concerns we have, and talk about what the deadlines are and what is to happen. So to start off with, we emphasized the very big in the cover here, because this is by a country mile the biggest investigation ITAC have ever carried out. And so in summary, this is what is being considered. So there's the negative side of the scale, which is all about reducing input costs. So bringing down the cost of both making steel and also lowering the cost of fabricating steel. And then on the other side, you could see which side of the scale gets a little bit more attention. Essentially increasing protection for the steel sector. Now, what has to be emphasized here is this is a review. It's called a review on steel, but the reality is this is a review on the whole steel value chain, starting from iron ore, going all the way through to fabricated steel products at the very end, things like padlocks, for example. It also covers all of stainless steel. So it's not just mild steel. It is an absolute beast of a review, covering about 609 tariff codes and about 67 billion rands worth of imports. So very, very large indeed. So let's kind of begin with the very first concept, all about lowering the cost of raw materials. So for the first time, we now have a review which is also poking into the mining industry. And what appears to be considered here are mechanisms to reduce the cost of iron ore, coking coal, and scrap metal. I'm not going to harp on scrap metal. Those who know me, I've said enough about scrap, but I want to touch on the other two in particular. Within the control of ITAC would be a mechanism like the price preference system on scrap. And that is essentially a forced domestic discount. And the way it works is if you want to export your product, let's say it's iron ore, before you can export it, you need to have an export permit. So that's the first intervention. To get the export permit, you need to offer it for sale at a discount. And that would be typically your potential export order would be given to ITAC. ITAC would circulate it to the potential buyers of that iron ore. There will be a minimum discount that has to be given. If we take steel, scrap steel, for example, it is 30%. So you make your offer at 30%, and then you cannot get the export permit for that amount of volume. And then beyond that, you could typically get your export permit. In 2024, we exported about 104 billion rands worth of coal of the kind that's used for coking, and another 109 billion of iron ore. So huge number of transactions, very large amount of trade. And in fact, bear in mind, the bulk of this is not used to produce steel locally. So a relatively small consumer would be potentially holding up the exports of these products. For scrap metal, we already have PPS, and we also have export duties. And export duties could be another mechanism. The Gazette simply does not make it clear. By the way, on the areas that were not clear, we've already asked ITAC for clarification, but by the time of the webinar, we haven't received it yet. So you could go the route of export duties, but there you would need National Treasury to take charge. So ITAC cannot create export duties, only Treasury. But it's a possibility, and we must look at that. The second issue is they're saying we're going to potentially go and create more rebates. So the steel sector has the most number of rebates. Rebates are an exemption from paying duty for certain conditions. So maybe because you make it a particular product, or you're not able to get the grade of product you need locally, or there's just not enough volume available locally. They're arguing that more rebates will need to be created. This looks as if companies or sectors or groups of companies would need to do the motivation. We have 80 temporary rebates on steel. That's quite a lot. The problem with creating more and more rebates is you run a very real risk of the rebates being abused, circumvention happening. The greater complexity you have, the greater that risk is. But that is another proposal. They've recognized, apparently, there's been some abuse of 3 rebates. So we quantified the impact of these rebates being removed without taking a view on whether there's merit in the argument. But the benefit of those 80 rebates has been to reduce the import duties by 520 million rand in the last year. If these 3 are removed, that would take 87 million rands worth of duty savings out, and those companies would then have to go and pay the tariff or buy the product locally. So there are 24 companies that use those rebates. 10 of those users have all of their rebates in there. In other words, all of their duty savings are contained within those 3 rebates, and 16 companies bank about half of the 87 million. So it does concentrate quite significantly. You can see the little orange bit. That is the bit that is at risk. The review covers 4 chapters. The rebates that they are threatening to remove are all contained only in chapter 72. So in fact, let me just pause for a second. I didn't put a slide together for this, but I should have. Quickly tell you what these respective chapters cover. So 72 is primary steel predominantly, including stainless steel. So both mild steel and stainless. This is where your hot rolled coils are, your galvanized coil, wire rod, these kinds of products. So your more basic steel products, also some of the precursors to steel. So all of the weird things that go into creating the steel alloys, they're also here. Then we've got chapter 73, which are articles made of steel. Think here of wire, or think here of steel pipes, or stainless steel pipes, or fasteners. This is where the action is happening in 73. In chapter 82, we my apologies, lost my train of thought quickly. Yes, chapter 82 is tools and cutlery. So stainless steel cutlery, tools like axes and hammers and wheelbarrows. This is in chapter 82. And then 83 is miscellaneous manufactured steel products. And this, my example of a padlock is a good example. It does not move beyond that. So the review is not covering more complex equipment like a car or something like that. That is where it ends. And these 4 chapters together account for, like I said, about 67 billion rands worth of imports. Okay. Then the next proposal is to take the duties up to the bound rate on 355. So of the 609 codes, 355 of them, we want to take it up to the bound rate. So what is the bound rate? When South Africa or any country joins the World Trade Organization, one of the things we do is we agree to bind ourselves to an upper limit on what we can raise our tariffs to. And that varies. For Chapter 72, most of it is 10 or 15%. Get to Chapter 73, kind of budget nudges up to 30% and so on. But this is the upper limit that you can take your duty rate to. And so there's a proposal here to just bang them all up to the bound rate where they are below the bound rate. If that were to happen, it would add another 1.76 billion rand in tariffs to the imports. Now, this would be, in my view at least, a bit of a nightmare. It would raise the cost of everything in the value chain. So it would not selectively raise, it would push up everything. And I presume my earlier comment on those new rebates, those would be created, I would think, to try to offset to some degree the effect of this. Most of the impact of this is, strangely enough, it's concentrated in Chapter 82, but the reason for that is that chapters like Chapters 72 and 73 to a lesser degree already have so much of their products at the bound rate. In other words, there's no headroom to take it up any further. But this would be an alarming moment. Now, there's a perspective around this that I think is important for us to just take a minute to understand. There are definitely problems in the steel sector, and many of those problems are related to trade. So we have China, who is behaving poorly, for example. We recognize that is a problem. But I think this very blunt solution to the problem is going to create a whole different set of problems, potentially far bigger than the current problem. So the effect of pushing everything up to the bound rate, if that is indeed what happens, would be to inflate the cost of the whole of the steel value chain. And my fear there is when you push that up, consumption of steel products will start to diminish. We certainly would lose exports. And we have mechanisms to try to reduce the impact of tariffs on exports. So we have rebates like the 47003 rebate, which is designed to allow you to import a raw material, not pay the duty, as long as you make something out of it that you then export. But there's been a reluctance at ITAC to issue permits under 47003 if there is a domestic alternative available. So the complexity that would arise out of this would be, I think, quite astonishing. I also think if this were to happen, we would have whole fabricators downstream running a non-trivial risk of simply going out of business because the aggregate demand, in my view, would probably drop off. Importantly, none of the mechanisms we're dealing with here deal with the demand side of the equation. All of them deal with the supply side. And the thinking appears to be that we want to concentrate the supply purely in South Africa. So we don't have any leakage of supply coming out of imports. So what we'd like to do is concentrate it here. And the way we're going to do that is essentially to lock out the imports. My personal view, we can debate this when we take questions, is that's a fairly poor idea. By the way, I've just been interrupted by myself here. Before people ask questions, type them up in the meantime if you want to, but there are journalists present here. So if you want to have a conversation that doesn't end up potentially in the media, then we need to schedule a separate call. Okay, but anyway, that can hold for a little bit. So the sense is we push it up and we take the imports out of the market, and then we have some time to sort of settle down and figure out what to do with the industry. But there's another recommendation in here, which is receiving fairly serious consideration at the moment, which is to simply blow past our bound rates. So the bound rates, like I said, is our WTO commitment. It's not only a WTO commitment, it's also within our own legislation. But the view seems to be that we can invoke Article 19 of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade to bypass our bound rate obligations. To be clear, we do not think this is legally allowable. Article 19 manifests as safeguards. In our view, if you want to invoke Article 19, which is essentially a temporary relief from your bound rate obligations, you need to do that by way of a safeguard. But I will tell you now why I think this is not how it's been interpreted, and the reason why they've used Article 19 instead of referring to safeguards. And here's a quote from yesterday by the Chief Commissioner, and he says, "Now, to what extent does having our tariffs bounded in the way that we have limit our ability to extend effective protection to the sector? That's something the review is looking at directly." This is not proof of anything, but this seems to be the direction. I am very concerned if this does actually manifest, but it would appear at the very least to be receiving serious consideration. So this is yet another component of the investigation. Continuing, they're also proposing to introduce import control on the tariffs under review. So what is import control? Import control says before you can import a product, you would need to get a permit. So you need to have permission, otherwise you can't do the import. The funny thing with asking for permission is permission can always be declined. What is not clear is what the implications are of declining the permission. So if you decline the permission, does it then mean that you can't do the import at all? We don't know. But this is one of the things being put on the table. It covers around 41 billion rands worth of import. This is based on the list that ITAC put forward. In other words, the list of tariff codes they are considering for import permits. That is the value going through there. And about 67 of our importers account for half of the imports that would be requiring a permit. 67 out of about 14,000 importers. And 15 of our importers account for 26% of all of the imports that could sit with a permit. Again, we've asked for clarity on this. We've not yet received an answer. For those of you who subscribe to our blog, when we have an answer, our blog will go to everyone and it'll answer. If you're not a subscriber, then please go to xagta.com after this, go to the blog page and subscribe and you'll get notified. There's also tariff rate quotas being proposed. Now, a tariff rate quota says you can import a certain quantity at one tariff, so let's say duty-free or at 10%, and beyond that, you will pay a higher tariff. So maybe it's at 0, and then you pay 15 when you've moved beyond a certain level. Now, one of the challenges with anything requiring a permit is not so much that, there is a problem with the permit being withheld, but permits can have all sorts of strange conditions attached to them. So, for example, the permit could potentially introduce a BEE requirement, or it could introduce a localization requirement for what you do with the product. So the minute you have a permit, you have an ability to attach whatever conditions. The conditions on a permit do not necessarily need to relate to the product itself. And we know this because we have permits on other products where there are other conditions added. And my example of BEE or localization are two examples which already exist in other areas. They could happen here as well. We do not know what is being proposed as conditions on the permit. So anything with a permit, just bear that in mind, has the potential at least to have some kind of condition added. We then have a proposal for compulsory standards. So new compulsory standards. Let me give you an example of this. So you've compulsory standards which are managed by the NRCS, the National Regulator for Compulsory Standards. These are different to voluntary standards. So a compulsory standard says if you do not meet the standard, usually for either health or safety issues, the import cannot happen. So you will have compulsory standards on medicines, for example. You can't just import a medicine from anyone. The medicine has to meet a certain standard. If you don't meet the standard, it's not about a tariff. You can't bring it in. Cement is another example. So when a standard is created that is compulsory, you cannot do the import without a certificate, typically a permit, that is issued by the NRCS before you can do your import. Otherwise, the goods simply can't enter the country. Now, I'm not suggesting, by the way, that this is always a bad thing. There are many things where you want to have compulsory standards because there's the real potential harm that can arise from the product if it is below standard. But I will give you an example here. Again, a quote from the Chief Commissioner. This is one of the areas being considered. I'm going to just read the whole thing for a minute because I'm not sure all of you can read. Let me just quickly read to you what he says. He says, to the extent there is arbitrage in specifications and standard for those galvanized and coated steel products, they could give rise to health and safety challenges. And he's talking here about very thin product, for example, that might be imported. And one part of what we are gazetting is to say, here are a few products, anything from steel tanks, tubing, and so on, to these galvanized steel products that we are considering recommending to the minister to be included under import control. And in other words, if the standard is not met because it's compulsory, this is different to a tariff, you will not be allowed to import the product. And again, I don't want to pass judgment on this. There are products which require standards, and there are some that probably don't. This is what is being considered. Increased import surveillance is the next thing. And specifically, they identify this for trade, environmental, and safety concerns. So some of that, I presume, refers to my previous slide. But there is a problem with things like customs fraud at the moment in the steel sector. This is not a secret. So it would be very good, in my mind, if customs fraud got better attention. It is a really terrible situation we've got with customs fraud in South Africa. The people who pay the price are local producers and legitimate importers. If customs fraud is not addressed, the sector that is experiencing the fraud will eventually simply be dominated by people who can get away with breaking the rules. So I'm very happy to see customs fraud receiving proper attention here. I personally think that's a good thing. The next is a concept of minimum import reference pricing. And this doesn't appear to be as a risk management tool. My reading of this is that the discussion is around actually taking the value that you declared to a minimum import price. So in other words, if the view is that the product should be imported at 1,000 Rand a ton and you are clearing it at 500, then the minimum value that you can use as a declaration would be 1,000. So in other words, you can't clear it below a particular value. I could be misreading this, but if I'm not misreading it, then that would also be a breach of the WTO valuation agreement. Again, we've asked questions, we've not received an answer. So I'm going to wrap up and then take questions in a minute. The most important bit for me is I am incredibly nervous of a trend being set where it becomes a norm that we can bypass our own legislation to achieve a particular economic goal. So the reason we have these commitments under the WTO in the Customs Act, et cetera, is because they're generally found to deliver better economic outcomes than if you don't. There are obviously moments when you can bypass it. So a safeguard is a perfect example of where you're allowed to breach your WTO commitments, but it comes with a set of rules. You can't arbitrarily breach it. My fear is if we take a kind of President Donald Trump approach to our trade policy and simply bypass the rules we have, then at some point it would just become easier to lobby to bypass rather than it would be to comply with the rules. And that leads us into a position where a winner in the short term can become a loser in the long term, because breaching those rules is not only something that can be used to the benefit of certain sectors of the steel industry, but can also be used against them at a later moment. So I don't often use the term slippery slope, but it feels quite appropriate here. And that, folks, is pretty much all I have to say. So very happy at this point to take questions from anyone. And by the way, if you want to ask a question, you can also stick your hand up and we'll take verbal questions. So I'm going to quickly go through the written questions that we've had so far. From Nico, is it possible to have a combination of various options mentioned? Nico, yes, it is. In fact, these do not appear to be mutually exclusive at all. So they do appear to be intended to be used on top of each other. So I don't think they are separate. If that doesn't answer your question, then that's fine. We can come back to it and just pop your hand up. And then Rainier says, could this mean that the current zero-rated goods, and he gives some tariff codes here, could become dutiable in the future? Rainier, that is exactly what the intention is. It's not a maybe. So your example of those codes, some of which I'm actually quite familiar with, yes, the idea is that they become dutiable. All right. Mindy, you first, and then Mike, I'll come to you right afterwards. Can you unmute Mindy? Is it Mindy or Lindy? God, I'm going blind. Nevertheless, Lindy Mtetwa. We'll come back to you. Mike, do you want to go?
Yeah, Donald, thanks. Good afternoon. I'm pleased that you mentioned the reporters in the room. I've got a few questions and comments, and just a couple of questions. So you mentioned that you are not clear on some of the items that they've listed in their gazette, in their notice. Can you elaborate on which those areas are where you are not clear?
Yes.
Or what they mean?
Yes. Do you want
yeah, you can answer that now. If you can just keep me online here for a while. I've got a few comments and questions to go through.
Absolutely, Mike. So I just want to just give me 1 second. I just want to quickly go through some of my own notes here. Yeah. So the areas I'm probably least clear on is the breach of the bound rate. That's probably the area I'm most worried about. So it's an incredibly vague paragraph in the Gazette, but if implemented, would potentially mean, I mean, this is a hypothetical percentage, but let's say it's at 25%. What it would mean is that all 4 chapters would simply go to 25%. Now, here's the things about that we don't know. There are hints in the media that what I've described is what is being proposed, but we don't have an explicit statement from anyone. We don't know if that means there will be a separate investigation to look at that, because that is also not clear. So in other words, are they asking, hey guys, do you think this is a good idea for us to look at? We'll kick off an investigation. Or are we in a position where we kind of wake up 3 months from now and everything's at 25%? So I don't know what it means. And we've put those questions to ITAC. That's probably the one that kind of alarms me more than anyone else.
So that's really around the safeguard issue.
Yes. So in other words, do you need to bring a safeguard, which is something that gets published and you get to comment on?
Yeah.
But a safeguard comes with a very specific set of rules on how you need to conduct yourself. What they appear to be proposing is skipping that step. In other words, there isn't a big investigation. What we do is essentially what Trump has done, which is you just put a blanket tariff in. And
well, that raises the other question. Can they institute temporary provisions while they're going through this investigation and asking for comments over a 4-week period and then taking a few months to deliberate and sort of digest it all? Can they institute temporary provisions right now? I ask that because we are aware that, I think it's no secret that AMSA and DTIC are in negotiations around keeping Newcastle open. And I think, we're all aware that AMSA are calling for various duties, etc., to protect them. And if they were to make an announcement in the next week or so, could they do that under a temporary provision? Pending finalization of this review?
So my personal view, Mike, is no, they can't do that, which is different to whether they will attempt to do it. That I can't answer. But I do not believe there would be a legal basis for them to do such a thing. No.
Could you send us the justification for why they would not have a legal ability to do that?
Well, I can answer it here. I mean, I'm happy to send it as well, but it's literally a paragraph. So in order to impose a provisional duty, you need a provision in the legislation that allows for provisional duties. So in an anti-dumping action or a safeguard or a countervailing, which is an anti-subsidy action, there you have a legal mechanism to impose provisional duties. For a tariff investigation, there is no mechanism to impose provisional duties. So in order for them to do that, they would have to invoke which section of the International Trade Administration Act that they're acting under. There isn't a section in there or in our regulations or in the Customs Act to impose provisional duties on tariff investigations.
Okay. Next question is around controlled pricing. Following wholesale duty frameworks that is designed to protect the capacity of local steel producers in this country. In the past, they've been subject to controlling domestic pricing through a basket mechanism.
Yep.
We were very critical of that back a few years ago, Donald, you and I.
Yep.
How do you think this will play out? And do you think there is a legal framework to impose that type of controlled pricing? So the example is local producers are protected to ensure that they're at capacity and producing at scale. Therefore, they can produce profitably and remain profitable. But they can't rape pardon this expression, the domestic consumer downstream and ensure, and we'd like to ensure some form of ceiling to the pricing. They can't go beyond a certain level. The tariffs can protect their capacity, their volume, but not necessarily allow them to profit beyond a certain level. What are your comments around that?
So the way subsequent to our experiences, Mike, the last time around, what has happened is, in fact, I should have had a slide on this, but the Minister of Trade and Industry has introduced this concept through ITAC of a reciprocal agreement. And one of the things in a reciprocal agreement is typically that there's an upper limit on how much you can increase your prices by. And just oversimplify this a bit, but basically you can't increase your price by more than what your raw material cost is increased by. Now, the way I think if they go down this road, the way they would do it would be through a reciprocal agreement. The problem we have with reciprocal agreements is nobody publishes them. So you never really know what the content is unless it's your own business. So my guess would be, Mike, that they would attempt to have some sort of price control. I don't like price controls, but I think I dislike tariffs without much thought on the detail, even more. But that is how I think they would try to regulate it. Now, these things become a nightmare because you're making a commitment, then you've got to get feedback every few months. You could go to the minister and show him reports. The problem is it removes agility from the market. So, if it's ArcelorMittal or Columbus or whoever it is that's producing the stuff, you're also confronted with a market that is changing, almost by the minute. Your idea that you need to kind of then go and plead for an increase, and then who's going to decide on it? I mean, you might remember last, Mike, there were customers of Mittal that were on the committee kind of deciding what their price could be. So I think it's not without complication if you go down the road of price control, but I think they would try to lock it into the agreement because there's no provision in the legislation for price control.
Yeah,
so
look, I'm certainly of the view that we need to institute something like that to one, protect the producer from wholesale dumping, but also protect the downstream community and users of steel so that they can remain competitive in their export markets, for instance, because they still compete against the errant item of steel that's coming out of China, for instance, because that's cheap and they're still competing at that level outside of the country when it comes to final finished goods. Okay, last question and last comment. When it comes to import permits, is it your experience that does one have to apply for a permit for each and every order, or can one apply for permits covering a product range for a period of time? And before you answer, when one asks for a permit basis the unreliability of a local producer, what's your experience around that? Because that's a little bit more complicated in terms of, yes, it's produced, but hey, guys, I'm not getting it reliably. The supply chain is broken. I need to go to a more reliable source.
Yes.
Hence, I want a permit. What are your comments around that?
Yeah. So I doubt it would be by shipment, Mike, just because there'd be no capacity. I mean, ITAC's already shorthanded. The idea that they could handle this by shipment, I just don't think is possible. So my guess is it's kind of, product for a period or a particular volume, and then, that's it. Then you kind of go back 6 months or a year later. That would be my guess, but I don't know with certainty. I mean, the problem is everything starts to become subjective when you have a permit. So you would say, I can't get the product locally. Maybe you have a technical spec you want. The local producer says, no, I can make that spec. Or I make an equivalent spec. You can use mine. You don't need to use the imported one. So the problem is everything starts to become subjective. And what we're then asking is a non-technical body like ITAC. I mean, ITAC's not sort of filled with metallurgists and supply chain experts, etc. What happens is you have a view, your supplier has a different view because the supplier doesn't want you to import anything. And the adjudication sits with people that don't really have the mechanism to evaluate both sides of that argument, and they need to do it under pressure. They can't just do it, take their time with it. So, I fear that the capacity constraint will become so severe that either nothing will come out or just arbitrarily be signed off. And I mean, we're dealing in other areas, non-steel related, with incredible delays, companies having to pay very large demurrage charges, etc., because there is a capacity constraint. ITAC just cannot work their way through so many applications all at the same time. So I worry about what happens when that capacity is exhausted. I don't know what happens, but probably not good things would be my take.
Thank you.
I'm going to take yours, and then we're going to quickly go to more of the written questions. Robert.
Oh, sorry, Ronald. Sorry, apologies. I think, a minute late in the meeting, so apologies if you have already discussed these answers. You had one slide where you said there are rebates. Well, for the 4 chapters, you had 3 categories, where one of the categories were what the rebates that are not at risk. Do you have a list of those rebates which are not at risk? And then you also mentioned on the same slide there are companies, I think it was 24 companies, which are at risk because of the rebates. Do you have the identity of those companies that you can disclose to us?
Okay, so let me start with the first question. Nadia, I'm going to ask you, when you send out the recording to everyone, please also include the Gazette again, plus the 2 annexures that go with the Gazette, because then that will answer your question, Robert, as to what is in or out. The second point is I can't discuss here who the companies are. We don't have them by name, but if anyone is concerned that they are at risk, they should contact us. We need a little bit of information from you. We can tell you if you are or not in the at-risk category. But at the moment, it's anonymized. So I don't know if your business or Mike's business is at risk. What I know is just the number of entities at risk and what the value is per entity. But if you contact me, Robert, we can answer the question for you.
Thanks. And then just the investigation of this whole review. I think in the email you mentioned that it should take years to complete. It might take 6 months, but I mean, 6 months is a very limited time. What is your feeling? How long will this review take before they will make any decisions?
Look, this is wild speculation, but let me give you some data to kind of back up my take on this. So on average, a tariff investigation takes 27 months at the moment. Some of them are heading for 5 years. So that's just a normal investigation without all of this. But there's massive political pressure here. There's pressure, understandably, from Mattel to get a lot of these things resolved. And also, many of the things that are discussed here are issues that should have been looked at in the last decade. So what you've done is you've kind of taken a decade's worth of work and crammed it into a month and said, let's see what we can do. The minister said he wants feedback by July. Now, what that means, I don't know. I can't see any prospect of this being wrapped up by July and a proper job being done. Whether by July, either the minister is going to have a very short memorandum from ITAC, or corners are going to be cut, or we misunderstand what the minister means when he says he needs feedback. But so it could be that the feedback to the minister is, well, we don't think we can invoke Article 19, or we can do it under these conditions. But if the decision is, are we going to do the increases? I have no idea how they would adjudicate in enough time, or not adjudicate, sorry, work through the data. And on that note, it's important that companies have to respond fully here, because this is the Gazette is a legal document. I mean, if you do not respond and you find yourself with your tariff at the bound rate, you're not going to be able to legally challenge that if you've done nothing in the intervening period. So, there are a lot of holes, I think, which we're trying to get resolved, but you shouldn't equate that with saying, well, they're holes, so we're not going to respond. I think if you don't respond, there's a real risk of something going wrong. So, and by the way, I'm saying that to anyone in the value chain, not just not just to one company like yours, Robert, or to Mike's. I'm saying if you're in this value chain and you want your tariff up, or you don't want it up, or you want, need a rebate, you have to argue for it here. You can't not argue for it because the Gazette is incomplete. Does that help?
Sorry, I know it helps a lot. Thank you. Last question. I'm not sure if it's applicable here, but do you know where ITAC is with that safeguard duty review? You know, the current safeguard duty review that they cancelled the initial rates.
No idea where they are. I would assume, without having any information, that it's imminent.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
I'm going to just group some of these questions because there's some similarity between some of them. So the PPS question on scrap, no, I don't think you can make the assumption nothing will be changed. I mean, one of the issues we've got is government did a PPS review on scrap metal last year and then promptly hasn't published their report. But they raise scrap metal in this Gazette specifically to be looked at as lowering the cost of. So no, I don't think you can make the assumption that PPS on scrap is not being looked at. They explicitly state that they are looking at it. What I would argue is they need to make available the report. We know they've completed the report. They need to make available their report on PPS before they take any decisions here on anything PPS related. Very sensible question. What is the tariff review trying to achieve? What is the ultimate goal? We know only what has been published. So the answer there is we don't know exactly what the objective is. What we do know, though, is there's a proper sense of panic, not entirely unreasonably either, that the world is awash with steel at the moment. China's construction sector has fallen over. There's too much steel in the market, chasing far too few projects, and everybody's in trouble. We need to do something. I think the Mittal's threat of closure is being taken very seriously. And I would think a part of this is what do we need to do to stop that event materializing? And again, my guess is that is what they're trying to achieve. There's a longer term question, which I don't think this review adequately addresses, which is you could do almost anything that delivers a short-term benefit. My concern is if all of this is being done in a rush, are the trade-offs being adequately measured? So whatever you do that creates a benefit for one, you are probably going to be costing someone else in the value chain something. My concern is that many of those may not manifest immediately, but I'd be horrified if 5 years from now we basically don't have a steel industry because we've only fixed short-term problems. But we don't know beyond that. Okay. The question, will comments and appeals be taken into consideration? My answer is yes, I think they genuinely will be. Maybe some of this has been pre-decided. I mean, there's no way to know that. But I think they genuinely will consider everything quite seriously. What I can also say is if you're unhappy with the outcome and you haven't made substantive comments, you can't come afterwards and say, well, you shouldn't have done this, but they didn't know about it. So, you've got to make your submission so that they can properly consider what you said. But no, I don't think this is pre-decided at all. Maybe some of it is, but that's not my take on it. Will this thing take? We don't entirely know how long. What we do know is the minister wants it wrapped up by July. Whether that will happen, we don't know. What we do know is in 2004, there was a review just of Chapter 72, and that took 13 months from when the Gazette got published to when the changes happened. and that was a fraction of the size of this. So that took over a year. That's the last time we've had a comparable kind of steel review. We had some kind of review in 2015, nowhere near as significant as this. It fails me for a moment how long that took, but I don't see any way that you can do this in 3 months at all. So I don't know. And, you know, I'd add something else. I mean, I'm aware that we've got some DTIC and probably some ITAC people that are sitting here. So to those, I would say the risk of litigation is non-trivial here. There are companies that will go out of business with the wrong decision, whatever that may be. So, you know, the decisions have to be taken rationally. If they are pre-decided, and this is for show, my guess is it will end poorly in court. And I mean, nobody wants that. Yeah, okay, let me just see. There's currently a trade agreement between South Africa and the EU. If the origin is other than the EU, you know, 15% tariff is applicable. Is government intending to relook at the trade agreements as well? Well, if they invoke Article 19 and safeguards, that is a bypass of all your trade agreements. So the safeguard or an anti-dumping action happens you know, on top of your obligation. So it removes the obligation for the EU, for example, you're allowed to impose on top of, because they're exceptional instruments. But no, I don't believe this is, you know, the review itself is not, the agreement itself, I don't believe is at any kind of risks. Okay, so I was going to ask one of my colleagues to look at exactly what the deadline is for us to make our submissions, but it's a month, it's 4 weeks from initiation. I will come back to you while we're sitting here with the exact date. We can request an extension. The tariff regulations only allow for a 2-week extension. So there is no mechanism to go beyond 2 weeks, but submissions can be supplemented afterwards. So you've got to get an initial submission in, but you can add to that submission afterwards. But your hard cutoff at the moment is 4 weeks with an extension, an extra 2 weeks, if that answers that.
16th of April, Donald. 16th of April.
Here we go. 16th of April. I think you're reading my own blog there, Mike. Then SEZs are still protected from any of these increases, right? So the answer is yes, in principle. If you produce in an SEZ and you export, you should be fine. But if you're producing in an SEZ for local consumption, the minute the goods leave the SEZ, you're going to be back in. And so you're only protected in as far as you're exporting, not local. Okay, please expand on the public comment process. And as a medium-sized manufacturer, what is the best avenue to give our input? The answer to that question consistently is you should get hold of us to help you. In the event that you don't want to use us, which is absolutely fine, I'm going to very strongly recommend you appoint an expert. This is not a job for your lawyer who does your divorce and property transfers and everything else. You need to go to an expert. There are a few of us in the market that do this. I would not do this on your own, because if this does have to get litigated later, you don't want to have received bad advice in the process. So, of course, you should contact us. You've got our contact details. But if you want to use someone else, we'll forgive your poor judgment. And you can still contact me, and I'll even give you people you can speak to. But to be clear, you can do your own submission. When you get the Gazette, you will see email addresses at the end of it. You can talk to them directly and make your own submission. Peter, you ask, you haven't seen the Gazette. Does it describe now why this tariff review is necessary? Well, it sort of does, but it does it in a slightly mealy-mouthed way. So it talks about things like you know, the importance of the steel industry and how it needs to be looked at, but it doesn't give you know, anything terribly solid on that. Yeah, so the answer is I'm not entirely sure what it is. If you give me 1 minute though, I'm going to quickly just give me 1 second. I'll quickly bring the Gazette up so everyone can have a little read themselves of what the objectives are. Give me a moment. So here's the reasons as given. Give me a sec. I just want to share my screen. So these are the 3 reasons that are provided. And again, everyone will receive a copy of the Gazette as soon as we're done here. But this is what is being proposed. So overcapacity globally, which is, I think everyone would agree with, slow economic growth, and we can make more things. Therefore, we should make them. And that's it. Very much the same talking points we've had on localization beforehand. So I don't think there's anything new there. Having said all of that, this is not to say that there are not problems. I mean, there is an enormous problem with an oversupply of steel globally. There is an enormous problem with government not doing the projects that they keep promising to do. So the demand side of this problem is left unaddressed in this. And I think my fear when you don't address the demand side of it is there's no growth in the market. All you're doing is you're reducing competition. That creates bloated businesses. My prediction on that is if these tariffs go up, our exports will collapse. That is what I think will happen. I don't think our exports will thrive in this environment. But everyone will get a copy of the Gazette as soon as we are done. Let me just try to figure out how to stop sharing this. Okay. Then it appears many businesses are at risk. Surely ITAC would have to consider this prior to making its decision. Let me just answer that. In theory, we can all agree that that's what should happen. But I'm not entirely confident that that is necessarily going to happen, but we certainly hope so. I mean, ITAC's not malicious here. They're certainly not trying to shut anyone down, but there are businesses at risk. I think the scope of this is so big that there will be collateral damage. If PPS is applied to iron ore and coking coal, does this mean Kumba would have to offer their product to the local market prior to export? Yes, it would. I believe it would look very similar to scrap. There isn't another mechanism to do it. If you don't have export control and you kind of work on the honor system, then nobody will actually bother doing anything. You'd have to have a legal mechanism to stop the export so that you can extract the lower price, or you would have to impose an export duty. But an export duty here, I argue, would be catastrophic. If you put an export duty in, you would penalize the 90% so that you can secure a supply for the 10%. But it is possible. What kind of industries are being considered to have exemptions or can preemptively apply, considering that certain materials are not supplied locally? The field is open for that. They're very clear that they recognize that more rebates would need to be created. So that is going to sit up to the companies. But if you're importing a product that you require that you can't get locally under these 4 chapters, then absolutely you should be asking for a rebate. I mean, of course, you should first call us to help you, but you should most definitely do that. Will the automotive industry be affected, importing of coils from the EU? If they do, what I think they are, yes, it would be. The automotive industry is always at the top of mind in government. So my guess is the automotive industry is I mean, they need to lobby their position here. The automotive industry needs to explain why they should be exempted. And I would guess rebates would be created. Remember, we're not just dealing with tariffs. We're also dealing with non-tariff barriers like the permitting systems. So yes, the tariff preference you get out of the EU should remain. But if, for example, they argue Article 19 the way they are choosing to do it, then we would have a problem. The EU would be automatically covered because that's the whole point of a safeguard. The talk of existing permits can be null and voided. What is the time frame on this? That I have not heard. So I didn't know that anyone's permits could be null and void. If that is the case, you need to get hold of me. I can't comment because I didn't even know that was it. We've answered the question on deadlines already. Will the relationship with China through BRICS impact the government not able to impose the duties they want? I think BRICS has largely been an opportunity for people to sit around and talk about how much they dislike the West more than anything else. There's no mechanisms inside of BRICS to deal with any of this. So BRICS has no trade component to it at all. So the answer is no, I don't think being a member of BRICS will be of any consequence one way or the other. How do you provide input? Well, the people to be contacted are ITAC. You could work with us or someone else, but that's how the submission works. So depending which aspect of this you want to get your teeth into, which is of course different for every single company, will determine how you argue it. We've asked them if there's a prescribed minimum kind of checklist of things they want. That's yet another thing we still don't have an answer on. Someone asks, what about export competitiveness? I've never seen any indication meaningfully that we actually care about export competitiveness, which is why we only export rocks on ships, cars which we subsidize, and agricultural products which we're very good at doing. So I'd like to think it matters, but I've seen very little evidence of government taking actions to actually improve our export competitiveness. So, yeah. And somebody just said hi, which is great. My favorite message. Does anyone else have anything? Because I'm going to have to run in a minute. Can ITAC go above the bound rates? Legally, we do not believe they can go above it unless they do a safeguard investigation. That, from what I've read in the media, is not the view that they have. You'll get our presentation after this as well. You'll see the comment from the Chief Commissioner. They appear to be very actively looking at breaching their bound rates. So we do not think there's a legal way to do that. And if it does happen, I think it should be legally challenged, but I don't know. I mean, because it's illegal doesn't mean it doesn't get done. Yeah. For anyone else, you guys have our details. My details are also at the end of the slide deck. You've got our email addresses. I can't take any calls immediately after this, but I am available later this evening. And if you do want to chat, please rather contact me on WhatsApp and send an email before simply calling. But otherwise, I am done. Nothing else? All right, guys. Have a wonderful day.